Hi everyone, welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you're new. Perhaps you stumbled across this video through a very specific search and you're hoping that I'm going to deliver, and I hope so too, because as you can tell from the title of this video, today I'm going to be talking about mythological texts from around the world, whether they're epic poetry, short poems, prose, etc., that explore the mythologies of a specific culture. So this video is in no way going to be an exhaustive list, and it's certainly not a top 10, it's simply just 10 books that I have read from around the world, which I feel are reasonably easily accessible to most readers looking for something in the English language that you can either buy because they're in print, or perhaps they're actually out of copyright and you can access them online, or you can get them from a library. But they're books that you can pick up, you can dive into, you can read, and I wanted to talk about them here. As you know, it's impossible to cover every single culture as well within the space of 10 books, and I really wanted to hone in not on books that compile myths from around the world in one space, which are phenomenal and that you may have already come across, but books that are the texts from one specific culture. Perhaps one author's interpretation, sure, or one version of a mythological like history or storytelling tradition, again, sure, but are like a source for those beliefs and those histories and those cultural stories. And I think it's really important when you read all of these books, whether you're reading them for educational or entertainment purposes, to remember that they do have a lot of cultural significance to both like historical, ancient people and modern day people. And that's one of the things that I think makes them so wonderful and so powerful. So yeah, I want to talk about those 10 books here in this video. I'm really excited to share them with you because I think it can be really intimidating when you're starting to look for texts from different mythologies from around the world that aren't Greek or Roman, because those are kind of everywhere, especially in Europe, very easily accessible, and a ton of which survive and were written down. Meanwhile, some cultures very much focus on oral storytelling, and it's much harder to find English books that record those myths. Even myself, I was thinking the other day about some of like the Scottish folk tales and traditional stories that I was raised on orally, that I heard from storytellers who came into my school or I saw speak at my local library, that I haven't really found a written version of either, which is really, really fascinating. And I'm sure you know that the oral storytelling tradition has a very long important history among like pretty much every culture. So yeah, I think that kind of covers the introduction of this video. If you have more recommendations, please do leave them in the comments down below. And I should actually probably note that I haven't included any Greek or Roman texts here because I've done quite a few videos on them in the past, and I actually want to do a new video updating how and where you can read Greek and Roman myths, because it is a mythology in particular that I have a lot of experience with, and that there are so many books on from antiquity and in the modern day that, you know, I think I'm going to do a deep dive, but this is meant to be like an accessible way to get into different mythologies. So yeah, let's do it, shall we? Future Jean here. I can't believe I forgot to say this, but maybe it's because I've said it so many times before that I didn't know if it was worth repeating, but I think it is, and that is a note on the word myth. The word myth is an ancient Greek word, or at least it comes from an ancient Greek word, mythos, which simply means story. There is nothing inherently false or fictitious in myths or mythology, and that is the sense in which I use the word myth and mythology throughout this video. So I think that's worth bearing in mind throughout. So first up, we have a Welsh text. This is the Mabinogion, which is an anonymously written text thought to be compiled by multiple different authors that was written in the medieval era. So obviously this book specifically deals with Welsh mythology and legend, but because the Welsh language is one branch of a overarching group of languages known as Celtic languages, you will see a lot of overlap in the characters and stories of this with other Celtic language groups, like the Gaelic, like the Brythonic, but also tales that are entirely unique to this book and variations that are entirely unique to this book. And it is probably one of my favourite mythological texts just to fully immerse yourself in. It is such a fascinating narrative, and like I mentioned, there will be recognisable characters in here for you most likely. There is a version of the warlord or King Arthur, who a lot of you might know through the Sword and the Stone legend. You'll find a ton of stories about the fair folk or the fairies, who in Welsh are known as the Tylwyth Teg, and characters like Rhiannon, who is either a fairy queen or a goddess depending on who you ask. And on that note, actually, I have to say that Rhiannon is one of my favourite characters or figures of mythology. She is an incredibly strong-willed, bold, logical, intelligent woman who I very much admire. So as you can probably tell, I really love this book, and I think you can very much just enjoy it by itself if you're learning about the Welsh culture, or if you're trying to read more widely about the different branches of Celtic folklore and mythology. Again, to reiterate, Celtic is not a culture, it is a language group. So there's a lot of variation in there, one of which is Welsh, and even then you get variations. I'm realising now it's probably a waste of time for me to say this is my favourite book, I love this book, because that's kind of a given, right? These are all incredible works of literature. Next up is actually a book I specifically inherited from my dad's collection of literature, and it is Indaba My Children by Credo Mutwa, which is actually subtitled here, African Tribal History, Legends, Customs and Religious Beliefs. Now specifically this book records mythological variations of the stories of the Bantu peoples, which include groups like the Zulu and the Shona of Africa. The book itself starts right at the beginning with versions of how the Great Spirit or God created the world, how Ma created the first humans, their rebellions, how things came to be as they currently are, and then a whole host of stories that follow on from that. I mean, this is a chunky book, but it is so absorbing and a wonderfully written book. So yeah, that is book number 2. Then next back, we travel back in time to antiquity and the ancient civilization of the Mesopotamians, which is now predominantly located in modern day Iraq. This is actually a super old edition of what I believe is still the Oxford University Classics book that you can pick up, collecting some of these tales together. But yeah, I think this is another one that I may have inherited from my dad, so it looks really different from, say, something like this. But this collects together some quite famous stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh, as well as one of my favourite myths and epics, which is Inanna's descent into the underworld. And it effectively gives us a glimpse into the mythological world of a culture that existed alongside the ancient Greeks, the Egyptians, but often I don't think we talk about or learn as much about. So if you genuinely enjoy learning about ancient civilizations and have yet to read this or any of the myths and epics in it, maybe not this edition, then get on it. It is fantastic. Next up is some Norse mythology, and I know this one is going to be of particular interest to a lot of Marvel fans, because if you want to see the original Thor and Loki, etc., then this is the book. This is the Elder Ada translated by Andy Orchard, although I think more commonly this is known as the Poetic Ada, correct me if I'm wrong, but this Penguin edition is called the Elder Ada, and it's a collection of poems about the gods and heroes of Norse mythology. And you, like I said, will encounter characters like Thor, and like I said, you will encounter gods like Thor, Loki in here. If you want to see Loki run around insulting every single god and making really inappropriate sexual innuendos and insults, then this is the book for you. If you want to see Thor throw a tantrum because Freya refuses to get married just so he can have his hammer back, then this is the book for you. If you want to see Freya stand up to the other gods for their sexism, then this is the book for you. It is such a entertaining and fascinating collection of poems that were originally written in the Old Norse, and I believe compiled in written form in the medieval era by, again, anonymous authors. Next up is the Calavala, which is an epic poem which was written down by the writer Elias Lönnrot. I'm really sorry if I butchered that. and it brings together the oral mythology and folklore of the Finnish people and the Karelian people of the Russian Republic of Karelia. And like I mentioned, this is an epic poem which, in fact, along with the Elder Ada, are both said to have been some of the texts that inspired J.R.R. Tolkien's writing, which has absolutely no bearing on the texts themselves, but might be an interesting point if you're like a die-hard Lord of the Rings or J.R.R. Tolkien fan and want to read some of the work that inspired him. So again, like a lot of these books actually, you'll find your creation story, in this case involving the air goddess Ilmatar. You'll find various stories about the underworld, heroic journeys, gods, goddesses, heroes, heroines, etc., mythical beasts. It is incredibly immersive, and again quite a chunky one which has a lot of meat to it. So yeah, one that I think is often overlooked in terms of like European specifically folklore and mythology, and one that shouldn't be. I should probably stop saying these are chunky though, because I've still got some chunky ones to show you that are chunkier yet, including this bad boy, which is the Shatter Me. And in fact this is actually, I believe, one of the longest epic poems to exist, so there you have it. But it is well worth a read. This is a Persian epic that was written in the medieval era that explores the history of the kings of pre-Islamic Persia. So we have a ton of like history and myth covered here. It's incredibly long, it spans hundreds and hundreds of years, and alongside those kings we have a smattering of mythical beasts and forbidden romances and kind of everything that you may have come to expect from epic mythological epics. And if you are into that subgenre, then this is one not to miss. But if you are looking for something a little bit quicker, a little bit shorter to pick up, then the next book was actually written for children but is absolutely for all ages, and that is The Legends of Mooney. This, when it was actually first published in the 1960s by Jacaranda Books, was the first ever Indigenous Australian children's book to be published in Australia, and it specifically charts some of the myths and folk tales of the Indigenous people from Fraser Island off the coast of Queensland. Again, you have a lot of stories about early humans and how they learned to set up societies and became who they were. You also have stories of how different animals became the way they are, and this in particular is accompanied by some really beautiful complementary illustrations that were done in tandem. So this book was written to be read and appreciated alongside these illustrations that were done in the traditional ways. But if you thought you'd seen some chunky books so far, be prepared, because the next one on my list is the Mahabharata, which is this book here. Yes indeed, chunky, but do not be deceived by this book alone, because this mythological epic is actually 10 times longer than the Greek Iliad, and I have it in 4 volumes. But it is this length for very good reason. This is a Hindu epic which in part charts the course of what is sometimes known as the Mahabharata War. Specifically, this was a civil war involving the Pandava brothers and their extended family. Now obviously it's going to be a complicated and lengthy story that charts what happens both before and after this conflict, but it truly is a masterpiece of literature, and it also includes the story of Draupadi, the wife of the Pandava brothers, who, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the most legendary women to have ever existed. So yeah, worth like dipping your toes in, even if you are a little bit intimidated by the thought of reading the whole thing. Now that's the last of my physical books, because the next 2 books on my list, one of which I can't find my copy of anywhere. Bookshelves all around this house, but no idea where I've put that. May have left it in my mum's house. And the second of which I actually read from the library. Now the first of these is the Nihongi, or the Chronicles of Japan, which is a work of Shinto Japanese mythology. And this one again charts so much. We have stories of gods and goddesses, including the creation story, and we also have the stories of historical emperors and empresses from ancient Japan. This book was composed in the early medieval era and is actually the second oldest work dealing with Japanese ancient history. Now while what the modern reader might consider the mythological part of this story, aka the part that deals with gods and goddesses, relatively short compared to the rest of the book, which predominantly deals with historical rulers, I ask you to once again return to what I said at the beginning of this video about myth and what myth means. And with that we come to the final book on this list, which is American Indian Stories, Legends and Other Writings by Calavala. Now this book is more of like a bind up, which brings together both the author's non-fiction writings and essays about her experiences, both as a Native American, specifically as a member of the Sioux tribe, and also as a child who was forcefully taken from her home by white Americans to be raised Christian in a boarding school, which is a history that you can get a gleam into from her non-fiction writing as well. And I think if you're going to pick up this book, then don't skip over that section in order to just read the Sioux myths and folk tales and legends that are included and written down by Calavala. Read it all. In terms of the myths collected here themselves, they deal a lot with different spirits of the Sioux tribe, including Iktomi, and the relationship between the Sioux tribe and the natural world and the animals in it, and how they came to be the way they were. And as I think with all of the books on this list, I feel like it's an absolute privilege that we are able to read about them and learn about different cultures, mythologies through them. So those are the 10 books that I wanted to talk to you about that cover the mythologies and folk tales and legends of various different peoples from around the world. And I really hope you've come away with this video feeling better equipped to read about mythologies from around the world, having learned about some books that maybe you didn't know existed before. There are obviously so many more works of mythology and folklore that exist that you can check out, and maybe there'll be some more recommendations in the description box down below. There are also many books which bring together lots of different sources and record oral versions of stories that were told to them. But like I said, these 10 books are starting points, so yeah, do check them out. They'll all be linked in the description box down below, and until next time, happy reading. I'll see you all again soon. Bye everybody.